While any mention of reparations for Black Americans is met with pro-clutching and eye rolls, America is no stranger to restorative justice. For instance, in 1948, Congress approved $38 million in reparations for Japanese Americans due to their internment during World War II, and 40 years later, $20,000 to each surviving individual through the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. In 1980, the Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act provided the Passamaquoddies and Penobscots tribes $81.5 million in restitution for land taken from tribes. Thus, the federal government has shown its capacity to acknowledge its culpability in harming some racial minorities. The problem is that the same reasoning seems to crumble whenever proposed on behalf of Black people. The federal government provided white enslavers reparations but failed to acknowledge any debt to the formerly enslaved and their descendants. This must have felt like salt in the wound for the newly freed Black people deprived of wealth. On April 16, 1862, President Abraham Lincoln signed the District of Columbia Compensated Emancipation Act, offering up to $300 for each freed slave. Such a statute challenges the notion that most white people in Union-controlled states ideologically opposed slavery. In reality, many had to be financially coaxed into abolition. While this strategy addressed that they'd lose money by granting them freedom, the legislature failed to provide Black people compensation for loss of wages or the physical and psychological abuse they endured, leaving them penniless. In a speech delivered in Charleston, South Carolina, 1967, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. noted that, in 1863, the Negro was freed from the bondage of physical slavery through the Emancipation Proclamation, but the Negro was not given land to make that freedom meaningful. Referencing the land promised by Sherman's Field Order 15, quickly confiscated following Lincoln's assassination, King compared the injustice of refusing to assist Black Americans to release an innocent man from jail after years of wrongful incarceration and denying him bus fare to travel to reconnect with family or money to get something to eat. Abolishing slavery while failing to reckon with the racial wealth gap produced by the franchise deprived Black Americans of an equal opportunity to prosper. One modern-day example of this rejection would be Oklahoma's failure to pay reparations to the survivors and descendants of the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, a tragedy that unfolded after a Black man, Dick Rowland, was falsely accused of harming a white woman in an elevator. Police deputized at least 500 white men and authorized them to shoot Black citizens at their discretion. The outcome was horrendous, as Black men, women, and children had no choice but to flee the area. Their violent outbursts destroyed over 35 blocks of homes and businesses in an area called Black Wall Street, killing hundreds. Survivors were forced at gunpoint into concentration centers. No white person was ever criminally charged for their participation. And neither the state nor the federal government has paid reparations. Why? It's hard to ignore the prominent role race plays in the willingness of citizens to support reparations. According to a Pew Research Center poll, Blazina and Cox, 2022, found that 77% of Black Americans, compared with 18% of white Americans, supported reparations for descendants of enslaved people. This apparent schism demonstrates how racial attitudes about this policy differ significantly among white and Black people. It's also hard to ignore the underlying conflict of interest here that white people collectively inherited from chattel slavery. Indeed, racism and a desire to maintain the racial hierarchy may obstruct discourse on the topic in earnest. Republicans, such as Mitch McConnell, the current minority leader in the Senate, claimed reparations are not a good idea, despite his family benefiting from the franchise. Many studies demonstrate the positive role reparations could play in mitigating racial disparities. For instance, Himmelstein et al., 2022, found that reparations, x $828,055 per household, would significantly reduce the racial gap in longevity between white and black Americans. A study published in Social Science and Medicine, 2021, suggested a restitutive program targeted towards black individuals would not only decrease COVID-19 risk for recipients of the wealth redistribution, the mitigating effects would also be distributed across racial groups, benefiting the population at large. Richardson et al., 2021. Such findings chip away at the myth that paying reparations to black people would harm other groups. Sadly, as Rhodes et al., 2024, concluded, negative racial attitudes constitute the largest single obstacle to public support for reparations to African Americans. Their analysis suggests racist attitudes are the main factor hindering political support for reparations proposals. President-elect Donald Trump recently shared his plans to direct the Department of Justice to pursue civil rights cases against schools he claims are perpetuating discrimination under the guise of equity, seizing their federal funding and redistributing that wealth to white people, the group he believes are the victims of diversity programs. He's implementing a policy consistent with the myth of reverse racism. Despite predominantly black high schools receiving less funding and black students experiencing numerous barriers in the college admissions process, conservatives, like Trump, have argued that white people are injured by programs that foster diversity, equity, and inclusion. Those who overlook racial disparities see programs designed to address racism as unnecessary at best and unjust at worst. Another layer of irony is added by the fact that white women have benefited the most from diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. Suppose white Americans are provided restitution for diversity programs under Trump's leadership. This decision would once again demonstrate that this nation is perfectly capable of engaging in restitution but unwilling to apply the principle to its black citizens. There's a painful irony to a country willing to provide former enslavers with monetary compensation while depriving reparations for the enslaved and their descendants. To provide restitution to white people purportedly impacted by diversity programs while overlooking the racial disparities that made such programs necessary. Exposing the prejudice at the heart of this nation's political palette. There is no political appetite for granting black Americans reparations because racism skews the lens through which we measure injustice. It explains why their cries have, thus far, fallen on deaf ears.